Hey guys, what's up? MadSeason here, back with another Legion class guide. This is an ongoing series where I go over the core gameplay of each class and spec in the Legion beta, and sort of give you an idea of how they're played and how their core mechanics work. In this video, we'll be going over the Feral Druid. Their gameplay hasn't changed too much from Draenor. Our main shape-shifting form is still cat form, which sort of gives you that predator feel. In this form, you have a wide variety of bleeds and other attacks to take down your enemies. As usual, let's get our disclaimers out of the way. The Druid is not my main class on Live. I did a lot of training on both Live and Legion to get a solid understanding of how the spec plays and how it's changing for this expansion, but keep in mind that this is all from a very casual Druid's perspective. Feral spec in particular is really new to me. It's one of the specs that I passed over in Draenor. Another thing to keep in mind is that this is all beta gameplay, so things that you like or don't like are always subject to change. A lot of spells have been changed, removed, or added. I'll go over all of them one by one in the spell book, and I'll also show you them all in action so you can get a good idea of how the spec plays to see if you would like it or not. And I'll sort of go over these in order of importance, putting a higher priority on the bread and butter abilities that make up the core of the Feral spec. And at the end of the video, I'll show you some real fights and narrate them a bit so you can see how all of it comes together. As I'm going through these, keep an eye on the bottom right hand corner of the screen if you want to see the tooltips for the exact numbers and such. Like I mentioned, cat form is still our standard DPS form. This gives you immunity to all polymorph effects, a 30% increase to run speed, and reduced falling damage. Next up, we have our basic combo point generator, Shred. This deals a medium amount of physical damage to your target and it generates 1 combo point. It costs 40 energy and it deals 20% increased damage to bleeding targets. And if you use it while stealthed, it has double the critical hit chance and 20% increased damage, which synergizes really nicely with her Primal Fury passive. This is the Druid's equivalent of the Rogue Seal Fate. When your combo point generators crit, you gain an additional combo point. So it's just a really good boost to your combo point generation. Note that your damage over time effects such as bleeds don't trigger this, however. Speaking of bleeds though, next up we have Rake. This is another combo point generator. It generates 1 point, has a cost of 35 energy, and it deals a light amount of initial damage to your target and some additional damage over 15 seconds. This one also has a bonus if you use it while stealthed. It'll deal 100% increased damage and it also stuns your target for 4 seconds. It also has a slow that's tied to our Infected Wounds passive. This causes your Rake to reduce your target's movement speed by 50% for 12 seconds, so this is our main slow this expansion. Anyways, next up we have our combo point spender, Rip. This is another bleed. It costs 30 energy, 1 to 5 combo points, and it deals bleeding damage over 24 seconds depending on how many points you spent on it. So along with Rake, this is something you're going to want to have 100% uptime on your target. Bleeds are going to be really important for us this expansion because their damage is increased by your mastery, Razor Claws. This gives you a flat damage increase to your cat form bleed abilities as you stack it. So it's pretty standard as far as masteries go. Most of the masteries this expansion are pretty straightforward, and this one is no exception. Next up we have Ferocious Bite, which is our more direct combo point spender. This costs 25 energy, consumes 1 to 5 combo points, and once again deals a varying amount of damage to your target depending on how many points you spend. You can also spend an additional 25 energy on it to give it a 100% damage boost. And if you use it on enemies below 25% health, you'll automatically refresh the duration of your Rip, so this is really strong in the later stages of a fight. Next up we have another bleed and AoE ability, Thrash. This costs 50 energy and it deals a light amount of damage to all nearby enemies, and some additional damage over 15 seconds. It has a pretty big 8-yard range, which is nice, and it's also usable while in bear form, although it does change a bit. When you're in bear form, this deals less damage over time, but you can stack it up to 3 times. It also has a base 6-second cooldown and it generates 4 rage. Speaking of bear form, this is still of course our tank form. It increases your armor by 200%, your stamina by 30%, and it gives you immunity to polymorph and increased threat generation. You really don't have a lot of abilities to use while you're in this form though, so it's strictly for survivability when you're being focused. Next up we have another AoE, Swipe. This is our more direct AoE. It costs 45 energy and it deals a light amount of physical damage to all enemies within 8 yards of you. It generates 1 combo point, and it also has a 20% damage bonus to bleeding targets similar to Shred, so you're always going to want to have Thrash up before you use this. And this is also usable while in bear form. It does lose the 20% damage bonus against bleeding targets, but it doesn't cost any rage, so it's something you can spam freely. Next up we have our final baseline combo point spender, Maim. This is a stun that's similar to the Rogue's Kidney Shot. It costs 35 energy, 1 to 5 combo points, and it stuns your target anywhere from 1 to 5 seconds depending on how many points you spent on it. It also deals some damage, which is a pretty nice bonus, and it has a 10-second cooldown, so it's just a really solid stun, I think. Next we have our classic Moonfire. This is a 40-yard range instant cast spell that deals a light amount of initial arcane damage to an enemy, and then some additional damage over 16 seconds. It's also usable in bear form and it won't pull you out of it. Its damage is very low, so it's mainly there for pulling or just throwing a dot on someone to keep them from stealthing. Next up we have our DPS cooldown, Berserk. This reduces the cost of all of your cat form abilities by 50%, and it also increases your maximum energy by 30 for 15 seconds. It has a 3-minute cooldown and it is a cat form only ability. So it's a pretty nice damage boost. Most classes have these 3-minute cooldowns now, so it's pretty standard. Next up we have Tiger's Fury. This instantly restores 60 energy, and it also increases the damage of your abilities by 15% for their full duration. So as long as you have this up when you apply their bleeds, they'll keep that 15% damage bonus even after Tiger's Fury wears off. It lasts for 8 seconds and it has a pretty generous 30-second cooldown. Next up we have our defensive cooldown, Survival Instincts. This is our basic shield wall. It reduces all damage you take by 50% for 6 seconds, and it has a 2-minute cooldown. You also get 2 charges of it, so it's a nice spell to have when you're in a bind. And next up, we'll go over our mobility. First up, we have Dash. When you use this, it activates cat form and it increases your movement speed by 70% for 15 seconds. It has a 3-minute cooldown, and you only get the effect when you're in cat form. So no big changes here, just a really solid mobility spell to have. We also have Stampeding Roar, which is our group speed boost. This increases the movement speed of all allies within 10 yards of you by 60% for 8 seconds, and it has a 2-minute cooldown. This can be really handy. It does require some coordination though, because the 10 yards is pretty restrictive. Next up we have our classic travel form. This shapeshifts you into a travel form appropriate to your location. If you're on land, you'll transform into a stag, which increases your movement speed by 40%. If you're on water, you transform into a seal. And if you're in a zone that allows flying, you'll transform into a bird, so it saves you some space on your action bars, which is nice. As for our healing, we do still have Healing Touch. This is a 40-yard range, base 2.5 second cast spell that heals your target for a small amount. It's pretty weak on its own, but it becomes really useful via the Predatory Swiftness talent. This causes your finishing moves to have a 20% chance per combo point spent to make your next Healing Touch, Entangling Roots, or Rebirth instant cast, free, and usable in all forms. So with this, you'll be using Healing Touch quite often as a way to keep your health topped off. Next up we have our Interrupt, Skull Bash. This is usable while in cat or bear form, and it causes you to charge your target and interrupt their spellcasting for 4 seconds. It has a 13-yard range and a 15-second cooldown, so it's just a really nice interrupt and mobility spell to have. For miscellaneous passives, first up we have Feline Swiftness, which gives you a 15% increase in movement speed at all times. And we also have Feral Instincts, which makes us harder to detect while Prowl is active. So this is just here to separate Feral's Prowl from all of the other specs. And lastly we have Omen of Clarity, which makes our auto attacks to have a chance to make your next cat form ability cost no energy. So just a really nice way to save some energy here. Without it, I have a feeling we would be pretty energy starved, so it's a pretty essential passive, I think. And that's pretty much it for all of the important stuff. Everything else I didn't mention are still functionally the same pretty much, maybe just percentage or cooldown changes. I'll mouse over them here quickly, and you can pause the video if you want to see the exact numbers, but abilities I haven't mentioned yet are Entangling Roots, Growl, Rebirth, which is our combat res, Remove Corruption, Revive, and Dreamwalk, which teleports us to our class hall. And that's every ability and passive. If I didn't list anything from Draenor, it was either moved to talents, removed entirely, or they just haven't put it back yet. Next up, I'll go over the revamped talents, and just like the abilities and passives, I'll go over every single talent here and show you them in action. I'll also have a link to the talent calculator in the description if you want to see them for yourself. First up, for the level 15 tier, we have Predator. This causes the cooldown of Tiger's Fury to reset whenever an enemy dies while you have a bleed on it. So I think this is more aimed towards dungeons and general solo play. It especially shines in AoE fights though if you combine it with Thrash. It is also worth noting that if you use it again before the duration wears out, the buff just refreshes. It doesn't stack or anything like that. Even still though, it's a really nice talent, I think. Next up, we have Blood Scent. This gives your cat form melee abilities to have a 10% increased critical strike chance against bleeding targets. So just a nice DPS boost here. You can basically consider this a passive 10% increased chance to crit because you're going to have a bleed up on your target most of the time anyways. And it is worth noting that this also helps you out with our combo point generation via the Primal Fury passive, which as you may recall gives us an extra combo point on our combo generator crits. Anyways, lastly for the level 15 tier we have Lunar Inspiration. This makes Moonfire usable in cat form, and it now generates 1 combo point, and its damage is increased based on your attack power. But to compensate for that, it does have a cost of 30 energy now. The damage is pretty decent, at least at level 100. It's by no means an outright replacement of Shred because most of its damage is through the dot, but it's an interesting talent to have and it gives you a little more ranged harassment, which will be handy in some situations I'm sure. For the level 30 tier we have Renewal. This instantly heals you for 30% of your maximum health with a 2-minute cooldown. Note that it does specifically point out that it's usable in all shapeshift forms, and remember we get a 30% increase in stamina while we're in bear form, so to maximize this, you're going to want to pop bear form before you use it. Next up for the level 30 tier we have our Displacer Beast. This teleports you 20 yards forward, activates cat form, and increases your movement speed by 50% for 4 seconds, and it has a 30-second cooldown. So just a really good mobility spell here, and I'm sure it's going to be a must-have on some of the higher mobility fights. And unlike Dash, you keep that movement speed out of cat form, which is a nice bonus. Lastly, for the level 30 tier, we have Wild Charge. This does a variety of different things depending on what shapeshift form you're in, all of them mobility based. If you're non-shapeshifted, you fly to an ally's position, sort of like a reverse leap of faith. In bear form, you charge an enemy and immobilize them for 4 seconds. In cat form, you leap behind an enemy and daze them for 3 seconds. In moonkin form, you bounce backwards, sort of like the hunter's disengage. In travel form, you leap forward 20 yards, and in aquatic form, your swim speed is increased by 150% for 5 seconds. All of the targeted skills have a 5 to 30 yard range and a 15-second cooldown, so once again, just a really nice talent to have for mobility. The level 45 tier is a little interesting because it gives you a choice of gaining Restoration, Guardian, or Balance abilities. First up, we have Balance Affinity, which gives you a 5 yard increase to the range of all of your abilities, and you also learn a bunch of balance skills. First up, we have Moonkin form. This shapeshifts you into a Moonkin, increasing your armor by 200%, and it gives you the normal immunity to polymorph and shapeshifting snare clear. It lasts until cancelled, and oddly enough, it has a cooldown of 1.5 minutes, which makes this the only shapeshifting form that has a cooldown. Next up, we have Sunfire, which is a dot. This deals a light amount of nature damage to a single target, and some additional damage over 12 seconds to that target and all enemies within 5 yards of it. And it does require Moonkin form. I'm thinking this actually may be worth it to throw it up in AoE fights. With this, you can have 2 AoE dots on everything before you start with your swipe spam. Next up, we have Solar Wrath. This is a base 1.5 second cast spell that deals a light amount of damage to a single target. Not much else to say about this, just a basic single target spell here. We also have Lunar Strike, which is just a beefier version of Solar Wrath. It deals more damage than Solar Wrath, but it has a longer base 2.5 second cast time. And we also have Star Surge. This has a base 2 second cast, a 10-second cooldown, and it deals a medium amount of astral damage to a single target. It also increases the damage of your next Lunar Strike and Solar Wrath spells by 20%. So your rotation is going to be Moonfire and Sunfire for your double dots, Star Surge on cooldown, and then consume those buffs on Solar Wrath and Lunar Strike. As for the usefulness of these abilities, I think they're handy to have in fights where you absolutely can't be in melee range. And like I said, if there are enough targets, it may be worth it to pop a quick Sunfire and then going back into cat form. This is one of the things I like about Druids. Even though this form isn't your specialty and it's not the most powerful thing ever, it gives you an option for utility and it sort of makes you a jack of all trades. Druid was one of the big hybrid specs in vanilla, so you can sort of see this whole tier as an echo of that, even though hybrid classes really aren't a thing anymore. Anyways, next up for the level 45 tier we have Guardian Affinity, which is how we're going to get some of our bear form abilities back. This passively makes you take 10% reduced damage, and you also learn Mangle, Iron Fur, and Frenzied Regeneration. Frenzied Regeneration is your heal. This costs 10 rage, and it heals you for 40% of the damage you've taken within the last 5 seconds over 3 seconds, with a minimum of 5% of your maximum life. It has 2 charges and a base 24-second recharge. And it is worth noting that when you enter bear form, you get 20 free rage, so this is something you can cast immediately, which is really nice. Next up, we have Iron Fur. This costs 45 rage, and it increases your armor by 75% for 6 seconds. It has a half-second cooldown, and you can overlap it if you're generating a lot of rage. We also have Mangle. This deals a medium amount of physical damage to a single target, and it deals 20% additional damage to bleeding targets. It has a base 6-second cooldown, and it generates 6 rage. So just some really handy defensive abilities from this talent. I have a feeling this is going to be the go-to choice for PvP because it gives you a lot of survivability. And lastly, for the level 45 tier, we have Restoration Affinity. When you have this, you also gain Ysera's Gift, which passively heals you for 3% of your maximum life every 5 seconds, and if you're at full life, a random ally will be healed instead. And to follow along with the scheme of things, you also get some abilities: Rejuvenation, Regrowth, and Swift Mend. Rejuvenation is our heal over time. This heals your target for a small amount over 15 seconds. Regrowth is our bigger heal. This has a base 1.5 second cast time, and it heals your target for a small amount initially, and a little more as a dot over 12 seconds. And its initial heal also has a 60% increased chance to be a crit. It does have a faster cast time and it heals for more than our standard healing touch, but it also has a way bigger mana cost, so it's not something that you can spam. And lastly, we have Swift Mend. This is an instant cast 30-second cooldown spell that heals your target for a pretty decent amount. The trade-off is, once again, its mana cost is pretty extreme. At level 100 and eye level 680 gear, it's a third of your mana bar. As for the level 60 tier, first up we have Mighty Bash. This is a basic stun. It lasts for 5 seconds, has a 50-second cooldown, and it's usable in all shapeshift forms. Not much else to say, just a really solid stun to have. Next up we have Mass Entanglement. This is our AoE entangling roots. This roots your target in place for 20 seconds, and it also spreads to nearby enemies. It has a 30-second cooldown, and just like Mighty Bash, it's usable in all shapeshift forms. Lastly, we have Typhoon. This is still our knockback. This calls a gust of wind, knocking back all enemies within 20 yards in front of you and dazing them for 6 seconds. And it has a 30-second cooldown. So 3 very different choices of crowd control here, and you'll probably be switching it around a lot depending on the situation. For the level 75 tier, we have Soul of the Forest. This is sort of similar to the Rogue's Relentless Strikes passive. This makes your finishing moves give you back 8 energy per combo point spent, of course giving you back 40 for a standard 5-point finisher. This is really noticeable, and it helps out with our energy generation a ton. So it's a good choice for those of you feeling energy starved. Next we have Incarnation, King of the Jungle. This one is an improvement to your Berserk cooldown. It's an improved cat form, it allows you to prowl in combat, and it causes Shred and Rake to deal damage as if stealth were active, so you always get those bonuses. It still also reduces the cost of all cat form abilities by 50%, and it increases your maximum energy by 50 just like Berserk. And another nice bonus is that it lasts for 30 seconds as opposed to Berserk's 15-second duration. So overall, just a huge improvement to that cooldown. Next up, we have another combo point spender, Savage Roar. This increases the damage of your cat form abilities by 25% for 8 seconds if you spent 1 point on it, and 24 if you spent 5. And it also has a 25 energy cost tied to it. This one is really good too, I think. It adds some more maintenance to the spec, which some people like and some people hate. I personally don't mind it. I always like having more stuff to do, and it'll change up your rotation by quite a bit, so it gets 2 thumbs up from me. Next up, we have some maintenance removal through the Sabertooth passive. This causes Ferocious Bite to always refresh the duration of Rip, instead of the normal 25% and under refresh. So like I mentioned, this is a good choice if you don't like having that maintenance. It's something you can have to lighten the load if you want Savage Roar, but you don't want to have too many things going on to keep track of. Either way though, this is still a really handy talent, I think. Next up, we have Jagged Wounds. This causes your Bleeds, Rip, Rake, and Thrash abilities to deal their damage in 33% less time. This brings Rip to 10 seconds, Rake to 16, and Thrash to 10. So this is a big damage increase to one of the main focuses of the spec, and it'll get more powerful the more mastery you stack. Lastly, for the level 90 tier, we have Elune's Guidance. This has a 45-second cooldown, and it immediately gives you 5 combo points and 1 combo point every second for 5 seconds. This gives you some really good burst, and I have to imagine it'll be a pretty appealing choice for PvP especially. I think the 45-second cooldown is pretty generous for what it does, so not too bad. For the level 100 tier, first up we have Brutal Slash, which is a replacement to our AoE, Swipe. This costs 20 energy as opposed to Swipe's 45, and it deals greatly increased damage. It does have a base 18-second recharge, but you get 3 charges of it. And it also generates a combo point just like Swipe, but it did lose the 20% damage bonus against bleeding targets. I think it's pretty strong. It's definitely more bursty, and its damage is high enough to where it's a viable single target option as well as AoE. Comparing it to Shred, it costs 20 less energy, and it deals around 10% increased damage, counting Shred's 20% bonus to bleeding targets. Those are the numbers in eye level 680 gear at level 100 though, so I can't really say if that's accurate or not. So I think this one's pretty decent, but the obvious downside to it though is that once you're out of charges, you're left with just Thrash spam as your primary means to AoE, which may not be a good choice for longer AoE fights. Anyways, next up we have Blood Talons, which causes your Healing Touch to make your next 2 melee abilities deal 30% increased damage for their full duration. This one is pretty strong as well. Remember that Predatory Swiftness gives you that free instant cast Healing Touch, so it's not like you have to stop what you're doing and cast that to benefit from this. So overall it's pretty good, and it's probably going to be a more common choice than Brutal Slash. Lastly, for the level 100 tier, we have Moment of Clarity, which causes Omen of Clarity to affect your next 3 cat form abilities as opposed to its base 1, and it also increases your maximum energy by 30. So once again, just another great choice for those of you feeling energy starved. If you combine this with Soul of the Forest, you're looking pretty good energy-wise, which really smooths out the gameplay. And that's it for all of the talents, as of this build anyways. Next up, I'll talk about the artifact for the Feral Druid, and those are the Fangs of Ashamain. The artifacts themselves have an ability called Ashamain's Frenzy. This is another bleed, although it's not something you'll have up all the time like Rake and Rip. This unleashes Ashamain's Frenzy on your target, dealing a medium amount of initial damage and a heavy amount of bleeding damage over 6 seconds. It also gives you 3 combo points, and it has a 1 minute and 15 second cooldown. This is really powerful because you're not locked into it for its duration. You're free to use other abilities while it's going on. So just like most other artifact abilities, it's really good, I think. And these artifacts also have some interesting passives you can unlock. You can find calculators for this all over the place, and I'll have a link in the description, but I'll go over the more major ones here. First up, we have Shadow Thrash. This makes Thrash have a 25% chance to release Ashamain's Soul, dealing a heavy amount of shadow damage to all nearby enemies over 2 seconds. This one is kind of interesting, but a downside to it is that it sort of clashes with their AoE game plan because normally we only thrash once for the bleed, and then swipe spam or brutal slash if you took that. This sets you up to just spam thrash as your AoE hoping for that 25% proc chance. Next up we have Open Wounds. This gives you a 15% armor penetration if Rip is active on your target. Not much else to say about this one, just a nice damage boost here. And lastly we have Ashamain's Bite. This causes your combo point generators on Rip targets to have a 3% chance to awaken the spirit of Ashamain, which inflicts a shadow duplicate of Rip on your target. This one is pretty rare to see. The 3% proc chance is quite low, but when it does proc, it's some nice bonus damage. It's about equal to the damage of your normal 5-point Rip. And the rest of these are pretty generic. Some interesting stuff, but mainly just percentage increases to abilities and whatnot. I'll mouse over them here quickly, and you can pause the video if you want to see the exact numbers. And like I said, I'll have a link to that calculator in the description if you want to check them out. You don't have to choose between any of these traits, you'll be able to get them all eventually. You just need to get enough artifact power, which you'll get by questing, PvPing, raiding, and so on. And that's it for all of the abilities, talents, and artifact traits, at least for this beta build anyways. I'm sure they'll add more or change some stuff later on, but that's okay because the purpose of this video is just to give you a basic idea of how the spec is played, and that's something that's very unlikely to change as they update the game. Now let's put all of this together. The only way to get an idea of how the spec is played is to see it in action, so as always I'll show you some basic fights here and narrate them a bit. Here are some single target fights. For talents I picked a Predator for that Tiger's Fury reset on kills, so you'll see me using that on pretty much every fight. I have Soul of the Force for that energy generation, Jagged Wounds for the faster bleeds, and for the level 100 tier I picked up Moment of Clarity for that 3-charge Omen of Clarity. And the rotation is what you would expect. As my stealth opener, I just go with Rake because it has that stun and increased damage, and then it's shred spam until I can get my Rip bleed out. Once you have both of your bleeds up, it's just a matter of shredding to 5 points so you can Ferocious Bite and then refresh your bleeds whenever you need to. As for cooldowns, like I said, I have Predator, so you'll see me using Tiger's Fury a lot here. I also use our artifact ability, Ashamain's Frenzy, sort of trying to save it when I'm out of energy and combo points, because remember, that generates 3. That can happen quite a bit if you're not getting those Omen of Clarity procs, but from what I can tell, that's sort of the Feral Druid style of DPS anyways. I don't want to comment too much on that since, like I said, I'm very new with the Feral spec and I sort of feel out of my element with that. Anyways, here are some AoE fights. For noteworthy talents, I have Balance Affinity for that Sunfire, Savage Roar since we really don't have any AoE combo point spenders anyways, Jagged Wounds for the better Thrash, and Brutal Slash just because I want to show that in action. Now one thing to keep in mind here is that this is all with an unleveled artifact, and remember we have some important AoE stuff in our artifacts, so definitely don't take this as a final product. My game plan here is to start off with a Sunfire, and then follow that up with a Berserk and a Thrash for that AoE bleed. After that I burn all 3 charges of my Brutal Slash, popping Tiger's Fury when I'm low on energy, and Savage Roar when I fill up on combo points. And I also throw in some Rake since I'm only fighting 3 mobs here. I found that once you're out of Brutal Slashes, your AoE damage is pretty low, and even if you stick with swipe spam, I don't think it'll be much better due to its high energy cost. I think this spec really banks on our artifact for our AoE. Without that leveled, our AoE damage does feel pretty low. Anyways, lastly, here's a longer single target fight. For noteworthy talents, I have Incarnation King of the Jungle for the improved Berserk, Elun's Guidance for those free combo points, and Blood Talents for that damage bonus after my healing touches. It's sort of the same deal as the shorter single target fights. It's just a matter of keeping up your bleeds, and here you'll see me using more cooldowns. Our single target damage overall seems pretty decent compared to most other specs. One thing I will say is that it seems like our rotation is more methodical, sort of like the Assassination Rogue. They have a big focus on bleeds as well, although Feral Druids don't have poisons, of course. But our energy and combo point generation are pretty close to that of the Assassination Rogues, so if you liked that spec, you may like the Feral Druid as well. But that's pretty much it. Hopefully now you have a better understanding and feel of how their core gameplay works. I think it's a pretty fun spec. Like I said, I never delved into Feral spec much since it's not really my style, but I think a lot of people will like them in Legion. I like their focus on bleeds, and with the way the talents are set up, you can fine-tune your gameplay a lot until it feels right for you. Like I mentioned earlier, that's one of the best things about Druids in general is that they're highly customizable, so it's a great choice for those of you who want to do a little bit of everything. Anyways, if you want to see more Feral gameplay, I also did a full dungeon run. No commentary on that though, just some raw gameplay for those of you who want to see more of what this spec is capable of. I'll have an annotation for that right here and a link in the description if you want to see that. As usual, feel free to leave me a message about your opinion on the state of the spec for Legion. Whether or not you like the changes though, I hope you at least found the video informative, interesting, or entertaining in some way. I have a lot of fun making these, so I hope you have a lot of fun watching them. Thanks for checking it out. I'll be doing guides like this for every spec for every class in the game, so keep an eye out for those if you're interested. And if you have any feedback or suggestions, feel free to leave me a message. There's always room for improvement. By the way, one last thing, there's no poll for the next class. The Demon Hunter is actually next because it won the poll a while ago, but they have to be level 110 to unlock all of their talents. I finally managed to get mine leveled, so that'll be the next class I cover. After that though, we'll be back to the normal polling system. Anyways, I hope you found this video helpful. Give it a like if you liked it, and if you really liked it, let me know in the comments and subscribe. And as always, thanks for watching, good luck, and peace.